Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Broadcast to Post. I'm Brad Kaplan, Senior Solutions Architect at Key Code Media. In this episode, we're talking about lighting smart choices before they become expensive mistakes. Joining me today is lighting legend Mike Grabowski from Lighting Design Group. Together, we've spent decades deploying professional lighting systems for broadcast, sports, corporate, the list goes on and on. In the next few minutes, we'll explore real-world upgrade strategies, swapping legacy tungsten systems for camera-aware LEDs, designing DMX-over-IP networks at scale, and choosing fixtures that won't flicker with high-speed shutter. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I guess, Mike, let's start with costs and cutting corners. If budget-wise, when you're looking at lighting, what do you see when you're putting projects together?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We're in an interesting space where cheaper equipment has made things a little more democratized, so everyone has more access. But I think at the same time, there are, I won't say pitfalls, I'll say considerations that need to get made, right? Like the biggest thing I see a lot of people overlook, especially when they're talking about it, you have to talk about this in a more broad and holistic way rather than just lighting or just, anything else. For me, flickering issues are really the crux of a lot of what you see is an issue. A lot of the lower end fixtures are not going to have what's called, you'll typically see it referred to as frequency or PWM, pulse width modulation. It gets into a whole sort of technical background on LEDs, but they don't really dim. They just sort of turn on and off at different frequencies to give the appearance of being brighter or dimmer. And sometimes that disaligns with a camera.
I'll just go from there. And I think what you're talking about, Mike, is that as people are investing in lighting products, that this may not be something that they're thinking of right away because it's not an option or in a setting. It's not something they put on the side of the box that says, frequency modulation or hertz is a common feature. But when you're investing in lighting, when you go for a cheaper product, those things are it's not something that they dial up first, but when you go for a more pro line, those things are thought of in advance. Like those are issues that are going to run up. So.
Correct. And, again, like the manufacturers, it's an easy way to make things more expensive. And if broadcast is not your consideration for a room or something like that, it's less of a concern. And you can find high-end stuff that doesn't have PWM editability and things like that. You get into architectural fixtures and things like that, which, again, broadcast and cameras are not usually their concern. But again, it's one of those things I always have the conversation with my clients about is we have to be aware of it because cell phones, right? Like everyone is videotaping, photoing, everything is recorded in some form or fashion beyond what a lot of people will think of as traditional broadcast. It's a consideration for concerts at this point. You want it to show up the way you designed and intended. Well, flicker and refresh rate becomes a real issue.
Do you have discussions with engineers and control room operators as well, or is this just something as you as a designer consider? Because I bring that to people and say, listen, you've got you can go with these lesser quality lights, I said, but you're just going to put the pressure on your control room to have to deal with it.
Yeah, and that's sort of where it boils down to, right? It's not a problem you're avoiding. Right? It is where you want to deal with it. And here's the thing. If you have, and I don't always want to call them lesser quality lights, they have different priorities. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like they want to make them more inexpensive, more affordable. If you have all of the same ones or all of them that hit the same frequency, you can sort of get away with it and frankly sort of shift it over to cameras because you can edit the shutter speed and get into some technical stuff on the camera side in order to accomplish getting rid of that camera roll or anything like that. But
right.
You have to sort of go into that eyes open, You
certainly do. Excellent. Well, I think it's really important. I think it's something that consumers need to think about when they're making choices, products presented to them, whether they're doing their own research or taking advice from you and my design group or myself. These are it's not just a feature that's like, oh, by the way, these are important things to think of on the Giddy up.
Yeah, because especially if you are buying from two different manufacturers, right? That's where you get into those complicated scenarios where you might have dissonant PWM frequencies, in which case camera is able to solve one of those. Camera can't solve multiple frequency issues. So if you have cameras operating at A frequency, one type of light operating at B frequency, and a second type of light operating at C frequency, you can align cameras to one of those, but not the other.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, and a lot of people really, both on the lighting side, on the engineering side, and then on the post side, they're all going to kind of have to work together to solve that. And it's as important as people are getting into building their studios. That's something to consider. I think kind of going from there, like talking about LED fixtures, they're not just plug and play. LED fixtures now have a whole host of technology embedded in them. They have menu options, they have modes. A lot of times when I'm putting together a project, you have to think about like how the client is going to end up using this product, and are they going to be getting their hands into the modes? Are they going to be messing with it in the future? So the complexity of modern fixtures versus what used to be just a standard 20 amp plug on the end of a light. Let's talk about how that's changed, because it's quite remarkable.
You remember that? Like it used to be, very easy. Here's a Fresnel. Can you go plug that in, and we'll pick which gel we want to put on it, right? Like
yeah, just barn is easy. Just diaper some barn doors and call it a day.
Yeah, exactly. Like the complicated stuff was, are we building an arts and crafts foam core thing to shape the light and all that nonsense? Like, I mean, now
those used to a whole dedicated team, the arts and crafts.
The arts and crafts team. No, but I think that's the thing, right? Like, there's technology in all of this, right? Some of a good example is, again, talking about some of those old school lights, right? A standard old school Lico, right? Beautiful, works great. Plug it in, away you go. But like, if you look at a more modern equivalent, whether it's ETC or Chauvet or whomever, it's sort of manufacturer agnostic at that point. If you look at their equivalent of the current generation of the stuff, you have the option of controlling that light engine directly, right? So a lot of them are typically red, green, blue. Now a lot of them are incorporating amber, lime, and white, and a whole host of different things to get the best rendered light out. You have the option of controlling each of those spectrums directly from the console, or you can rely on that manufacturer to give you simplified modes where you're controlling it via HueSat, or even simpler where you're controlling it via color temperature, even though it's not just directly a color temperature fixture. And where it gets sort of funny is, let's say you put a fixture like that in color temperature mode, and this gets a little in the weeds, but you're using 2 parameters, in a hypothetical. Whereas if we're doing it in full color of red, green, blue, amber, lime, now you're talking 5 parameters. So if you don't necessarily plan out your infrastructure and lighting system footprint, you could be buggered up down the line if suddenly you decide, oh, you know what, I do want to open up all those possibilities. So it's again, a lot of designers early on with LED stuff, you've seen it, right, would use LEDs, especially color changing stuff, as a way to avoid decisions. And a lot of ways you have inherited a whole host of more decisions and thoughts that have to happen.
Do you think that programming time, I mean, it's obviously, when you go to color temperature mode, you pick your intensity, you pick your color temperature. there you go. You're not worried about plus minus screen, all those kind of things. They're not really
Yeah.
part of that equation. But when you're going into these deeper levels of time of programming, and you have different, you're bringing in more attributes to your fixture.
Yeah.
How does that impact your programming time versus what you get out on the other
That's
side when you get your final camera shots?
Well, and that's where you inherit needing a lot more time, right? Because, for example, I was just over at MSG last night, and we were doing inside the NBA. We were doing the TNT broadcast of the Knicks game, and to me, I tend to like to go more full parameter control of RGB, L, or whatever the picture will do, because going purely color temp or going in a fairly simplified way is ideal in more, I'll call it idealistic scenarios, where you're in a very controlled studio, and even then, it's based on the assumption you're not really getting impacted by anything else. You look at an MSG, I have house lights, I have changing arena lights, I have the work lights in there, I have all this stuff that I'm competing with. So even if I want to put out perfect 4,500 degree light, I need to actually, take into consideration the house lights are a little bit to the green side, so I need to add a shade of couple hits of magenta so everyone looks really nice. You know what? We go into another sequence where I need to be able to pull that back because they shut off those house lights. So for me, having those operability moments become part of my thought and design process. Whereas if I had just had that at color temp, they would technically be the right color temperature, but then would be a little magenta or a little green at different points. And that sounds like a sort of out there scenario, but I've dealt with that in a studio with a light box. Of a studio will change its light box from a beautiful morning sunrise with lots of like warm colors and magentas, and that just gets on your anchor, either on the back, on the side of their face, just a little bit. But you want to be able to control your lights to sort of compensate a little for that. And then conversely, they go to the evening news or go to an evening look, and suddenly it's blue and cyan and all of that. And now you need to compensate in a slightly different way. So it's interesting. Again, there's a lot of interoperability, a lot of crossover that lighting never could really stay in one tiny lane. It was, amongst all the disciplines, the one that had to cross over the most. To me, it feels like it's even more, I mean, what do you think? I think you've seen not dissimilar,
And it's interesting in the integration side of things, and I was going to kind of bridge that into my next part of my question was, or the conversation was, that we turn systems over to clients, and so it's a question of how educated is the client, and do they need that level of like. Sometimes the client says, yes, I'd love to learn more about that, and you can go into some of that. And sometimes clients are just like, hey, we need the lights to work, and just give me the color temperature I want. And
yeah,
I think education is super important in this industry now more than ever, because there's so many more layers. But
well, and
a lot of times smaller studios don't have lighting directors on site, and they just have to kind of say, listen, our best educated guess is to hit 5,600 and call it.
and that's fine. But to me, and we've all dealt with that, right? Like that's fairly standard, especially you look at local affiliates or things like that are operating on such slim margins, and like one guy doing one-man band,
Everything.
Those dudes are amazing. Like that stuff is nutto. And I get it, but at the same time, I think a lot of it does fall to our responsibility to train, educate, inform. Like one of the biggest pitfalls that I always see, that I always advocate for, and it's always a decent sized cost, and I always hate putting that out there, is the one thing everyone seems to forget about LEDs in general: shut them off. And when I say shut them off, power them off. A lot of them are rated for 50,000 hours, 70,000 hours, whatever that massive number is. And a lot of times clients will see in their head, oh my God, 50,000, 70,000. That's like 10 years. And I can deal with a CapEx hit again in, 10 years of 70,000, hours of use
That's
time.
not how it works.
And that's
The-
exactly it. Like
yeah,
that's how long that machine is on and powered,
yeah.
not how many
It's think
hours
about
of light output.
well, it's
Uh,
like you could turn your car on and leave the engine running, and you're not going to burn the gas. The car's just going to sit there. But, oh well, the car's got all the full tank of gas. It's just going to sit idle. Well,
yeah,
eventually, it's going to get through all that gas, and whether you drive it and you go through the tank a little quicker, that's well, okay. You're burning your LEDs, or if your car is just sitting in the parking lot but the engine's running, you're still burning gas a little
yeah,
slower. You got to shut the
yeah,
car off to
yeah,
not burn the gas. And that's
yeah.
a
I
big
mean,
thing. We actually we tell our clients all the time, like especially schools and educational houses of worship, like when you're not using the
yes,
gear, it's not enough just to hit the grandmaster and turn them off. You got to go to the breaker panel and turn them off. Or we put in these relay modules. You got to shut this stuff off. You got to save your investment. You know, make your investment work for you and save it.
yeah, and that's exactly it. And that's 100% it. Like we put in, smart racks and the equivalent, of DMX controllable racks. So literally you can just hit a button on the console and it'll turn off all the breakers. That's an expensive option.
Yep.
The other option, you said it. Go over to the breakers and just click them off.
Yeah.
Because again, they're computers. You know what I mean? You don't have
Yeah.
you're not putting runtime. If you have your computer just on, you're putting runtime on it. It is
Yeah.
gentle wear and tear, but that's wear and tear, and that counts towards that quote unquote engine life
Yeah.
that you'll see touted as 70,000 or 50,000. That big number. And I remember in the early days of LEDs, no one knew that, and then suddenly everything started failing at like a 2-year, 3-year point, and everyone's like, "Wait, no, the math says I should be good for another 6 or 7 years."
Right. Right. Well, because you didn't turn them off. Those
It was
computers
on
just
for
get
24, 365. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
That was the big learning curve, I think, for all of us early on with it.
definitely. Oh yeah. So in schools and institutions have kind of learned that the hard way. And as you feel like, oh my gosh, we got to go back to the well now. But like, ay.
And,
What do you?
and I hate
Those are
telling clients,
part of the learning curve.
and I hate telling clients that because
Mhm.
it sometimes means they can afford less lights or things like that. But like,
Right.
especially institutions that have limited capex access, it is something it's boring, it is banal, it is unfun, unsexy stuff to talk about. But,
Right. Yeah.
and like, again, I just want to be honest with my clients. I want to be honest with everyone. Like, there
Yeah.
are,
Well, that's what we have to be.
like, there are other people who are not going to put that, boring stuff out there and just, hey, you said you wanted 400 lights. I'll just sell you 400 lights. All right, maybe you should probably get
Right.
350 and consider that now you can take care of them for
Some relay
10 years.
modules to help you save
Yeah,
so
you know what
there's
I mean?
products out there that it doesn't have to be these massive installed relay panels. There are other products out there that are inline relays that
Yeah,
you have to put in, and that's the products are out there.
yeah.
Oh, and you just go,
And
oh, I see a lot more infrastructure and I want more lights. Like, well, do you have to have the infrastructure there?
yeah, you know what I
Um,
mean? It's sort of like old school stuff, right? We were talking about dimmers before.
mhm.
You couldn't just buy a old Fresnel. You had to have a dimmer somewhere. I mean, you didn't have to, but
Yeah.
if you wanted console control and things like
Yeah.
that, you needed a dimmer in some form. This is just a different version of that conversation. Dimmers were always kind of boring.
Right. Yeah. Because they're in the background,
Yeah,
you
but
know?
again, the upside is you're talking to more of a one-time investment with infrastructure like that. But and there
Right.
are, as you touched on, there aren't there aren't just day zero items like that. There can be
Yeah.
aftermarket, there can be down the line stuff as well. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of goes into infrastructure planning and, again, the dimmers and the relay panels aren't, um, they're not out there on set in your line of sight products. But so in your history, in your experience, what are the biggest infrastructure oversights that people don't think that they need to invest in that in my situation, we get a lot of clients and we say, the infrastructure is not just buying the lights and a controller. Do you have a dimming system that we have to rip out and put in a panel, or we have to convert, your old raceways from stage pin to Edison, or do we got to buy adapters? I mean, in your experience, what's often overlooked in the infrastructure planning?
Data infrastructure. I mean, I think that fundamentally is always I don't know about overlooked, but it's always the under-considered part.
That's a very key, under-considered. That's a great way to put it.
You know what I mean? Because everyone's like, oh yeah, no, it needs data. But again, like when you think about the technical logistics and like you can plan for your day 1 projects or your day 10 projects. And that's always the conversation I want to have. Like we redid MTV Studios in Times Square. So I started at TRL and all that a million years ago. And like, that was awesome. We started that, and that was old school Fresnels, HMIs, the big windows and Carson Daly and all that. And that was pretty straightforward. But even for a show like that, we had a lot of data, a lot of moving lights. We were on the bleeding edge of LED stuff and all that. After that show got canceled, we did a gut renovation of that entire studio. Not a lot of people know that used to be 3 studios. There was an uptown, a midtown, a downtown. And, Yo MTV Raps would be in downtown. TRL would be in the uptown. Midtown would be our flex space and all that. And sometimes we do performances out of there. Well,
I just remember we using that being
2000. I did a lot of New Year's. I did a lot of New Year's Eves in there. There was.
I would just get stuck up on top of the Bertelsmann building behind a follow spot.
On the Bertels.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, my God. We would have something in the neighborhood.
Little days.
12 performances in a 90-minute New Year's Eve show. That was fast track chaos, But again, it boils down to what you're saying, though. Data infrastructure, all that stuff becomes really important considerations in how all that works. We ended up with data points all over in a way that wasn't really considered for a incandescent studio. And then when we did the renovation, Aeropostale took over and then took over half the space. We gutted it, and that was when we flipped. That's when we flipped the space to be basically conversant for LED. One of the silly things that I'll always advocate for is hospital grade outlets. It sounds silly. It sounds boring. Everything is generally Edison, and we plug it in and away you go. But Edison outlets are not great in a grid, right? They work on friction.
Correct.
Inside of each slot in a Edison outlet are 2 bits of copper sort of pinching, and then you're sliding that blade of your thing in, and most of them are built for walls, so it just sort of works. In a hospital outlet, those, I'll call them the pincers that are inside the outlets, are built of thicker copper with higher tension, so you always have more friction.
So grips that.
So that
grips
way,
the blade. Yeah.
So if you're putting them vertical in a grid, that tension is going to maintain. You're not going to fall out. So if you want to make everything easy and conversant and Edison, that's what we did there. We did all hospital grade outlets, and now we did that first renovation in 2008, 2009. It's functionally, 15, 16 years later. We haven't had
phenomenal.
We haven't had to change one of them,
That's phenomenal. And that's a credit to like doing your research and doing your homework and presenting, hey, listen, there's a little more on your upfront costs, but like, listen, here we are years later and we still don't have any issues with this. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. 15.
It's kind of, that's remarkable. Speaking of data infrastructure, there's a lot more wireless data, and it's something I talk about with clients at a time, but it's also a scary conversation because data over wireless is prone to problems. And we have a lot of clients that say, oh, we can just Bluetooth, or we could just use our phone to adjust this. And I said,
Please don't.
yeah, for like 1 or 2 fixtures, but you don't want to be. And a lot of schools don't want to. They don't have the money for infrastructure, so just use wireless. I think it's great, but I'm really nervous that wireless is not a catch-all.
I agree. The short version is yes.
Mhm.
For me though, it's interesting. Like you sort of implied the exact point I would go to is wireless takes more tech, people, infrastructure um, than not. You know, it makes certain things easier. It to me, it is a way to get data to an inaccessible point. It is not
Mm.
an easier thing. It has the appearances of being easier. I know
Yeah.
a bunch of my buddies work on Daredevil for Netflix, right? And I was over there, we were visiting, and they have smart lights, LEDs, all over creation in a building on a location. And if you're doing a movie infrastructure on location, oh my gosh, that is a
Mm.
godsend of being able to wirelessly send
Right.
data everywhere. That said,
Yep.
my buddy, the programmer, has a laptop and an iPad open, constantly looking at frequencies and looking at, because you never know, even if you're in a studio or something like that, who else is going to suddenly turn on, you know, uh, put on an access point or, add wireless interference into the infrastructure that on day zero you plan for this is what your available spectrum bandwidth is.
Yep.
you know, there's I was talking to a friend who's on Stranger Things on Broadway, and she was telling me a funny story. They have so much wireless stuff, a necessity of the show, like down to like
Sure.
wireless DMX flashlights, all sorts of stuff. But they had to put in such a robust wireless infrastructure that it
Mhm.
actually was stronger than the Wi-Fi in the building, so it actually knocked out the Wi-Fi. So, like, you know what I mean?
Phenomenal.
Oh yeah, but
Yeah.
but that's sort of the thing. It's an arms race. Like, we're treading on existing infrastructure. Like, if anyone's ever interested, download. There's a million of them. Download a Wi-Fi analyzer and open it up, and even in fairly remote places, things like that, you are going to be stunned by how much junk is sort of in the air that you're competing with. And again, you have to figure out antenna strength, latency issues. Again, none of it's not overcomable, but you inherit a lot of logistics. And I think part of it is across the board. All of it to me is about education, learning
Mhm.
about this stuff. None of this stuff is magic. Like, you, me, we
Yeah.
happen to have done it for a long time and have accumulated a lot of knowledge. It's all out there. It's all on
Yeah.
the internet. It's all somewhere. Like, it's all findable.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a lot of this is hard learned lessons, and not just
But
advocating.
my
Yeah.
counter story to your for
Yeah.
Broadway shows, we were working on a project up at the West Point Military Academy, and we're like, oh, we're gonna do this wirelessly, and we ran all of our tech, we ran all of our rehearsals, everything was done over a wireless. But for the show, it's West Point. You don't know what frequencies they're gonna pump out on a military base. We ran fiber optics for the night of the show
Yep.
because that was the only way to make sure that we didn't. And we ran several hundred feet of fiber optics. That's just what that was the guarantee. We couldn't take that chance to say, yeah, we're just going to run wireless to all 150 fixtures. Couldn't do it.
Yeah. But I think that's the counterpoint, right? I think that's the
Mhm.
interesting part you hit on is, to me, a quick aside. I remember we did New Year's Eve, and we were doing Powerball, and we were over at the Marriott Marquis in Times Square. And not many people know this. The Marquis Theater at the time had Beetlejuice running in it. And
Mhm.
we had a ton of set electrics and all of that. And in part, the reason Stranger Things has such a robust wireless system, they're in the same theater as Beetlejuice was on their December 30th show. We had a lot of wireless in the ballroom for a lot of set electrics and stuff. and we fired it up,
Mm-hmm.
and man, did we bugger up that performance of Beetlejuice. Set electrics weren't working for them left and right. They were using low-powered, normal stuff,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
why would you think that in a ballroom 3 floors away, someone doing a New Year's Eve show is going to impact you? Like,
In Times Square,
in
in New
Times
York
Square.
City, where there's a bazillion frequencies,
Yeah.
between the police department, the fire department,
Yeah.
any other, city agency that's going to be having communications, plus all the other frequencies that are there generally. You've got
Yeah.
Radio City Music Hall not too far away.
You have every
You've got
theater. You have a
every-
theater
every
100 feet from any given direction with
and
30 wireless mics.
TV studios. I think that NASDAQ had a studio there at the time. I mean,
still does, yeah.
there's just ABC.
Mm-hmm. But the other thing, and then what I was going to say, and you mentioning the West Point thing, it's the biggest thing I'll encourage a lot of my clients to look at is backboning in an agnostic way. Like, I'll go to MTV again, right? When we did that studio, there's always, you've heard it too, I'm sure. There's always talk of switching, lights will switch over to Ethernet. All of them will be EtherCon or whatever. So far, no one's done it. Like for dual input light with like that are pixely and all that, fine. But that's always been the conversation in the sort of like dealers talking about and all, and manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it means everything should be built agnostic. MTV being a good example of it. We did it in all of our studios.
Mm-hmm.
We've done it at CNN. We've done it at Bloomberg. Pretty much every studio LDG is involved with. What we advocate for, backbone it in Ethernet. Backbone it in the most current, high-gen, high-output Ethernet system that you can. You had mentioned fiber. Look at fiber infrastructure. When I'm doing like U.S. figure skating on the road, we end up having to go massive distances. There's technology for moving. That's sort of the best part of everything becoming so data-driven. Is there are established processes and backbone and infrastructure for getting data from point A to point B. And nothing we're transmitting with DMX or anything is particularly high volume or complicated data. DMX is a 40-year-old protocol. It's, you know what I mean? It's tiny, tiny, tiny. So anything that's used to carrying current, So anything that's used to carrying current data can carry our stuff. So to me, backboning in Ethernet, looking at fiber infrastructure, it means construction teams know how to do it. I remember talking to guys about pulling, when we built Time Warner Center, where CNN used to be before they moved to Hudson Yards. We had to have actual DM. Yeah, right. You remember that install, but like I remember dealing with ECs and talking to them about what's this 5-wire thing? Like, what's DMX? Like, what's that? That's not real, and they would, but it only says 3 are active. So can't we just pull 3-wire and all this stuff? Now there's no conversation. Pull some low voltage, pull some Ethernet cable, A to B, and then great, we'll put on a faceplate that flips it from Ethernet to 5-pin, and everyone's easy. Getting low voltage pulls makes sense to every EC on the planet.
Yep, and they do it every day now. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So, what do you see as the next? What do you see as the next thing for lighting, studio lighting? Where do you see it going at this point? I mean, what's in your mind? Where do you see this technology going? I think the data side of it is just getting more and more fascinating because we're pulling a lot more Ethernet and Cat6 cable and just more data ports all over the place. Lights are getting smarter, controllers are getting smarter. People are using their phones and their smart devices to control it. I mean, where do you? My vision is like this is just going to keep going higher and higher. There's just more and more options. And where do you see this going?
I think similar. I think the other part is, in a lot of ways, lighting used to be much more isolated, right? You'd have an LD, a programmer, a board op, a whomever bringing up the lights for the desk or bringing up the room lights or doing this or editing or doing little stuff.
Mhm.
And I think you're looking at more interoperability, more crossover, more remote access stuff. I mean, that's something we've really driven home on a lot of projects. There are products
Yeah.
out there that let us log into the lighting systems. And to me, that's its own problem. Like I'm still a bit of an
That's a
old,
blessing and a curse.
yeah, you know what I mean? Like I'm old school like that, right? Like the idea of putting my lighting system on internet, closed or open, or a way to access it from the outside world, you know, opens up the possibility that someone I don't want to is going to do it, you know. Um,
Yeah.
and there's generally a lot of protection and robustness around it, and like realistically, in the long run, who really is going to want to log into a TV studio and turn the lights green? Like, you know,
I used to I when I was on tour, the joke was to see you take your phone and you go into and see if you could log into the console and see if if I could get the right passcode for Tool, then I can maybe make fixture make that moving light go over there. Like it was kind of a joke, but like
yeah,
you could. It's
yeah,
actually kind of plausible now. It's not that complicated anymore.
yeah. I mean, it's something you and I have talked about offline. Is at this point, in its own weird nutso way, like we need to not really, but sort of have an IT degree at this point. You know,
You really
like
do.
you know what I mean, or we just have much. We need much more familiarity with network infrastructure. You know, just computer networking in general than we need it even 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You know,
Right.
um,
No, I mean, years ago, you just needed to know how to run some BNC cable between your console and your remote focus unit, and
yeah,
your remote visualizer, and in your studio, and that was it. Now just you ran some BNC. Now you have to run. You get to have Cat 6 over this, and you got to connect into this network here, and you have a rack full of switches, and it's not just opto splitters and some and a couple of universes now where everything now is 10 plus universes, and you got to have a switch involved, and you got
yeah,
to be an IT tech, and you got to coordinate with other people in that world too.
yeah. It's really interesting. Like, but again, it's one of those instances. I think every discipline always has to keep learning, always has to keep marching
Oh
progress
yes.
forward. But I think lighting, camera, tech infrastructure feels like it's on that much faster of a curve, you know. Um, because I think the interesting part is it's not just what's working and currently happening, but also manufacturers and all that trying stuff and us having to be willing to
Yeah.
try it too a little bit, you know? I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago the prevalence of the tiny little PTZ cameras in studios? 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I'm probably
Huge.
timelining this a little wrong, but like at a certain point, not terribly far ago, those things were barely able to put out uh, security camera grade footage, you know?
Yeah.
And now they look beautiful, you know? Are
Yeah.
going to have as many handles or as much, manipulatability as like a quote unquote proper studio camera? No, you never will. But they're
They've
remarkably
come a long way.
yeah, and they're remarkably affordable. And if you, again, that is that collaboration moment. You are offboarding some of your editability with a camera, but now to me, you have to have a little more consideration on the lighting side. It's
Yeah.
Peloton in New York and London has a number of PTZ cameras, and that was exactly what we ended up doing there. Um,
Mhm.
excuse me, was because Peloton uses PTZ cameras. They want to keep the footprint minimal in the room with members in the room. Entirely understandable.
And
You can't have, giant, robopeds in the room. That would be silly. Um,
hitting cyclists upside the head.
uh,
Watch out.
I can, I can see it, but that meant
New jib move.
we've done it. We have put it is chaos incarnate, but we've done it. But the other part is like now everything has to rely on the lighting side a little bit stronger, right? They don't have the handles to, I remember a few of the class teachers and all would come in having been on vacation and are a little red, a little sunburned, you know. And normally in a studio, you could sort of paint that out a little and, just help them out. You don't have that option necessarily on all the PTZs. So great, lighting come in and hit some buttons and we can sort of just help them out, But like we were saying, you don't lose the problem. It just sort of shifts where you're going to deal with. Yeah,
Yeah.
But I think it's also knowing that you have that option.
That's remarkable. Yeah. It's again, like it kind of puts more burden on the department, the lighting designer, the staff, the programmers. But I think it solves the problem for a lot of people upstream of that, like it's like, oh, we don't, so that lighting becomes more of it's often the last thing people think of, but it becomes more of the, hey, I'm glad we thought of that because they're going to save the day.
Yeah, because in post, imagine having to deal with that in post, right? Peloton, for example, has such a remarkable tight turnaround between when they do a live class and when it's posted, sometimes minutes. Imagine if they had to do the live class, except that somebody looked a little red, a little green, a little off.
Goodness, yeah.
They would have to then take that, put it in post, take an hour class, and then have an editor scrub and like zone edit if you even want to go down that rabbit hole, or you're putting out content where your host doesn't look their greatest, and that's not good either. Like it's sort of picking your poison of where and how you want to deal with it.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable stuff, and I think it's only going to get more interesting in the future. And I think that brains like yours out there, and history that we have out there, and the stuff that I brought to the table, for Key Code has really been kind of like, oh, let's the future is bright.
It is, and it's stuff like it's stuff like what you and I had talked about, right? There was the little project that Key Code and LDG collaborated on that I think is the crux of a lot of that sort of new media stuff, right? You have a control room in City A. You have a studio, 100 and some odd miles away?
It was 60 miles away. Yeah. The control room and facility was in City A, and then studio and was in City B, and there was 60 miles between, and there was like, how do we control this? And we could do that now. It's remarkable. That's not like, that's crazy. How could you think of that?
No, but again,
it didn't take much to put it together.
No, and it's small packet data, right? Like there's network. There's a lot of again, we got deep in on network infrastructure, ports, and pretty heavy level IT stuff. Ironically, the lighting and actual execution were the easy part, and now the client, the client in the control room has a big button that says, morning show, afternoon show, evening show.
Yep.
And it makes it easy for their tech, like part of it's realizing what your workflow is. Part of it's working within your workflow, being honest with yourself of what your tech, your human, whoever you have, has the bandwidth to do. Sometimes that honesty means it's going to cost a little more, or, there are harder parts to VE in that. Or not, it just means a lot of it's about education and honesty, if we're boiling it all down.
So I think that's something for everybody. Mike, this has been a great conversation. I'm really excited for the future and all the things
we're
going to see. Yeah, and so now we're going to go to the live portion, the Q&A portion of the event. So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you there.
This episode brought to you by Studio Network Solutions. Media teams have enough things to worry about. Storage shouldn't be one of them. That's where Studio Network Solutions comes in. SNS makes your shared storage, media management, and cloud workflows easy so you can focus on what you do best, creating. See how SNS can help your team at studionetworksolutions.com.
Have you ever watched a production and thought, wow, that lighting is perfect, but then the host stares into the void like they forgot how to read? Yeah, that's because they didn't use ICANN. See, ICANN makes top-tier studio lighting, prompters, and gear that keep productions looking and running smooth. So whether you need buttery soft LED lights or rock-solid teleprompters so you don't forget your lines, or just pro-level gear that won't let you down, ICANN has you covered. So if you want your production to look like $1 million without spending $1 million, check out ICANN. Because great lighting and a good prompter can make anyone look like a pro. You know, in the world of live production, there are two types of people. Those who think they can rely on sketchy hotel Wi-Fi, and those who use LiveView. See, LiveView is the industry leader in bonded cellular technology, meaning you can go live from just about anywhere. Stadiums, newsrooms, a moving car, probably even the moon, but we'll let NASA test that one. From broadcasters to YouTubers, LiveView makes it easy to deliver high-quality, low-latency video without the stress. No more crossed fingers, no more laggy feeds. Just rock-solid, reliable live production. So if you're tired of watching your stream buffer while your viewers drop off, check out LiveView. Because in live production, there are no second chances.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Broadcast to Post. We are live. My name is Brad Kaplan. I'm joined today with Mike Grabowski, and thank you for coming to join us. We just watched the pre-recorded presentation, and now we want to kind of continue the conversation. If there are any questions from anybody who's watching, but any of the topics Mike and I touched on, or anything else you have about lighting systems, design, technology, certainly feel free to put them into the question on the chat. Mike, how are you today? Where are you? You look like you're someplace special.
I'm looking like a bit of a goblin down here. I'm over at MSP for Game 5 of the Knicks. We're out here with Turner.
Mike, I don't think I can hear you, Mike. Try again. Sorry.
Hold on. How about now? You got me now?
No.
Let me try that. Is that any better?
No, not yet, unfortunately. But you're going to work on your technical, and I will continue to take some time here. So some of the questions that have come up in the past are about maintaining lighting systems and stuff like that. And what do we do? So a lot of times new systems will be installed. Clients will figure, how do we maintain them? How do we keep our investment current? Yeah, you know, it's not necessarily there are software updates for control consoles. There are you can work with the manufacturers on that. As far as the equipment is concerned, I mean, if you're going to go up in the air, you're going to want to, you know, make sure that you're keeping the stuff kind of the dust off of it, so that, you know, the electronics inside are not getting all gummed up. A lot of this great stuff is more resilient than ever before. A lot of times equipment will be spec'd as IP because it's a little more, well, it's weather resistant, but IP doesn't necessarily mean it's outdoor rated. It also works great in a studio. So it really is a helpful thing when you're putting gear into a studio. Look for IP rated and kind of equipment that can handle the outdoor abuse, because it could definitely handle your indoor abuse. There you go. Fun fact. You're back, Mike.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, sir.
Great. Good. Yes, to answer your earlier question, I'm hiding in the bounds of the MSG. We're doing Inside the NBA tonight.
Fantastic.
So we've been out on tour with them, running around between Indy and New York, and we're getting ready for all that. But I'll piggyback on what you said. IP rated is good. It means the lights are heavier, though. Something worth having in your head.
But it certainly does resist the buildup of dust. It does build up the resistance of all the particulate in a studio or any location with a school, because we all know that once these lights go up in a school situation, they don't go up and dust them off. They just stay there for a long time. And I've gone up on a lift and there's just a coating everywhere. You're like, okay, and you know, bulbs used to just burn it off.
I remember when we used to be at Food Network, the old Food Network, when everything was incandescent, Lecos, Fresnels, and when they had Emerald Live, Sarah's Secrets, all the cooking shows, those lights would be the gnarliest, nastiest things in the world. After 9 months of cooking shows, a half inch of baked on grease on a Leco lens was gnarly.
I bet. Yeah. We have our first question from online from Jonathan Belcher. Replacing Lecos and Fresnels, what are the drawbacks? Seems to be good color, consistent look. What are you seeing on your side of the world?
Replacing, sorry, part of that broke up, but replacing Lecos and Fresnels, I think honestly, it's not terrible. I mean, a lot of times I'm doing hybridized shows. I do a lot of the reunion shows, a lot of the Bravo reunions and stuff like that. And I think, Brad, you did them with me way back in the day too. And like a lot of those are hybridized. We have LED Lecos paired with incandescent Fresnels and things like that. A lot of it comes down to programming, metering, and again, quality of light. I think we had touched on it when you and I were talking before, Brad, of like making sure the spectral consistency is there. You know, it depends on what your application is. You have a little more forgiveness if you're solely talking about live events, but a lot of it's about color matching in the programming. You know, a Luster and ECL Leco, like a lot of the manufacturers of Chauvet Lecos are awesome. Fresnels are a little funnier. There's a handful of decent Fresnel options, but a lot of times people get trapped in I'm using a Fresnel for a Fresnel's sake when really maybe a par makes the most sense in the current environment of lights. You know, are you getting the benefits out of I'm hard pressed to say an old like Altman 6-inch Fresnel, like the classic like overstage theater light in high schools, right? I'm hard pressed that's just doing like a base wash of the room. I'm hard pressed to say you couldn't just replace that with a Colorado Solo or a very, not to any specific thing, there's a litany of options out there. A Color Force 12, you could use a whole bunch of things to accomplish a similar thing. So I wouldn't necessarily always look to go Leco for Leco, Fresnel for Fresnel. To me, it's end use.
Yeah. One of the big things that gets brought up in the integration side, and I know you see it out in the live world, LED walls and the impact on the studio. And I don't think we touched on it at all in our previous conversation, but in your experience with LED walls, regulating brightness, overcoming the hop between front light, backlight, LED wall, pushing through it all, different colors on the LED wall and accounting for all that. What is your experience and what are your solutions, frankly?
It becomes a remarkably technical rabbit hole, right? You know, you have sort of first line logistics, right? If you are pointing a light at a screen, it's going to be dimmer or darker or brighter or different than what you intend and what you see out of your source video. That is physics. You know what I mean? There's science right there. You can't have someone standing against a video wall and light them appropriately without having some reduction in quality in what that screen is. There are tricks around it, but you have to sort of be realistic of what you have. You can't just suddenly light someone from the side because you want to put them against the video wall. That's not going to be the most flattering. It'll be like what's happening to me right now. You know, it's not going to be ideal for talent in those scenarios. So I think a lot of it is looking at what the logistics are. What are your immovable objects, right? Okay, great. You're putting in a video wall. That's going to output light. That's going to output source. What are the other immovable objects? And then to me, you have to sort of work backwards from those points. Is it, and 9 times out of 10, if you have a video wall, if it's a live event, if it's a corporate event, if it's a presentation, you have the ability to move your presenter downstage. You have the ability to put them 10 or 15 feet away from it, in which case you light them pretty much like you normally would. But again, it's figuring out what color balance that screen is at, what intensity that screen is at. Is it going to change colors if you dim it? You know, part of it's talking to and having a very competent video and production team working on that side and making sure, you know, especially speaking to the system side, that those components are built in. You know, it's not just about what you're doing day one, it's about what you might do on day 10. Do we need to be able to dim it down? In which case, great. Do we need extra color correctors? You know, there are points where, oh no, we're never going to use this for broadcast. Oh wait, we're just going to use it for social media. We're going to use it for Zooms. We're going to use it for this. Well, that's not technically broadcast, but it's so broadcast
That's all
adjacent.
broadcast.
You're inheriting the same problems. So, you know, functionality wise, even though it doesn't feel like broadcast, you're inheriting the same problems. If that makes sense.
It does, and it kind of dovetails into the next question about flicker and hertz. So the next question that's popped up here is talking about flicker, and we have RGB strip lights that are a different frequency than a lit sign, but also has dimming capabilities. Is there any way to get them to match? I mean, if your RGB
No.
strip lights have
No,
hertz
not
mode
really.
in them,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of bottlenecked by whatever one has the editability, you know.
But if your lit
There's-
sign,
there's-
just to answer the question, if the lit sign is coming from a dimmer, you can't adjust the frequency on a dimmer. And certainly with, you know,
the one thing you can do, especially, and it depends on what the sign is and not having a lot of context, if it's an LED sign and it's like LED neon or something like that, there are certain instances, and not knowing the specifics of this, where you can replace the power supply on something like that, or a power supply that does have one with adjustable PWM, adjustable hertz, in which case you could potentially match the sign to your strip light, but I guess the strip light is likely the immovable object in that scenario. You have a small potential of being able to replace a component on the sign to match.
that seems like a very strong answer, and I think it's the best answer. Renard is asking about retrofitting. Key Code, we get a lot of inquiries about retrofitting. A lot of studios have pre-existing conditions. A lot of manufacturers make a retrofit kit. I think it's a great alternative is when you don't have a huge budget. I know like a lot of Lego fixtures have retrofit caps in the back, park hands, soft lights have retrofit. Again, I think that's a great option when you have a limited budget, but you still have to build out your infrastructure to make all that work. You can't go and just say, okay, we're going to just put a retrofit kit in and call it done. You have to put all your backbone in. You have to put data systems in. You have to change your power systems over to a non-dim system. So are you seeing a lot of that in your world? Do you get a lot of calls for?
I do. And to me, it always is the most boring answer. Unfortunately, is like, you have to do the boring stuff first, right? It's fun, it's sexier, it's more engaging to replace the lights and have RGB lights or, you know, color changing stuff. Unless you have the technical and system capabilities of doing that and manipulating those systems, you really should look at your systems and infrastructure. Now, it doesn't mean you need a gajillion dollars to do that, right? You need an appropriate console. You need at least some fundamental level of DMX or data distribution, which again can be hit at a, you know, sub 20 grand, probably sub 15 price point. But you need to really consider that as step one. And it's the boring step. You know, you don't, it's not suddenly going to give you a lot more dynamic color changing and all that fun stuff, but it means you could potentially retrofit your set, you know, with LEDs in it, which sometimes is a good step one. If you do that basics of infrastructure, then put some light boxes in your set that you can manipulate and change time of day with or things like that. And then step two, you know, on the next CapEx cycle or something like that is, okay, now let's look at fixtures. To me, that's been a path that a lot of my folks have gone down. You know,
it's go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I was curious if that's what you're seeing as well.
We're not. It's a question often comes up, and I haven't had the opportunity to sell a lot of those systems or push a lot of those systems yet. But it's a question that comes up because there's also a labor cost to it as well. You have to have, you know, you have to take the system offline. you have to take the system, you have to get these fixtures wired up and back in place. So there's a chance that you may be offline for, where you just install new fixtures, and plug and play, data cables and whatnot. When you take the lights down over time, you got to, what's your downtime on that?
Yeah. And I will say, though, the biggest thing I've always been an advocate for, you sort of tangentially touched on, if the walls are open, everything's cheaper. If you are doing a fiber upgrade, if you are doing a camera upgrade, if you are doing a control room upgrade functionally, at that point, the walls are open for infrastructure to happen. That is the time to put in Ethernet backbone systems. Even if you don't use it immediately, run those lines. Like, it is going to cost you pennies on the dollar compared to a year later to reopen the walls, bring in the EC or a low voltage puller, put all that stuff in a year after you do a control room upgrade. If you're doing any phase of that, I cannot recommend more, at least putting in a half dozen, a couple Ethernet lines just to have for future use case. Even if you don't use them for lighting, you're never going to be sad to have extra lines going from control room or key points into the studio. And it's always so much cheaper when the walls are open.
It's true. Kind of bouncing into another question, and it's kind of keeping along the same lines of the walls being opened, is converting a conference room into a multi-use room. How do you balance budget with quality of fixtures?
I think you come down to what you want, right? I think
Mm.
if and I apologize, it sort of sounds like I'm saying the same thing over and over, but I've found over the years, like, the more clarity you have on end use of what your project is and potential future uses is the best way to balance what you are going to do budgetarily. And it might mean early on, it hurts a little more, sometimes you are pulling for those extra lines. Sometimes you are, but it means it's going to be long-term cheaper and more effective. There have been times where we've done those conference room flips and basically put in either a small hard set or a virtual set or something like that. And we've only built it for like one person. And then it takes off and other execs see it and they're like, oh my God, this is great. We should use this for our town halls and use it for additional stuff or use it for bigger setups. But because things were very fiscally conservative on step one, it means now we have to open up the walls to run more lines and, a little more infrastructure. And that becomes wildly more costly. On the upside, Ethernet is fairly cheap. If you're running one, run three. It costs you practically nothing more, especially if it's unterminated or just in a box on either side for future use. And then going to the lights on it, I would just try and maybe make sure you have what will work. If you know you are a brand that doesn't do color or, you tend to be fairly stoic in your presentations, then great. You don't need necessarily RGB full color units. You can get away with a little more, but understand what that limitation is for you in the future with those same fixtures. I don't think you have to buy gajillion-dollar fixtures all the time. A lot of times those are for longer throw, for bigger throw, for that sort of thing. You can get approachable price point fixtures,
And that's the biggest hurdle, I think, from an integrator, from a designer, from anybody at any level of production, is trying to balance that, the consumer, the prosumer, and professional grade equipment. Sometimes a studio, you can use consumer grade for certain things. If your set lights don't have to be full crazy, there's a lot of prosumer gear out there that's phenomenal. And if you're on a budget, if you're trying to just kind of create something for a startup to see if it works, then
And
and then you can build on that.
I think the other two things I'll always put out there. I know LDG, my company in the gang, will always be happy to just set up a demo. Like, here, we'll go take it to an office, take a look. Does this work for you? I think no matter who you go to, whether it's me, Brad, whomever, I think the question you should always ask is, what does this system limit me in doing? If I max out this system, what is the most I can do with it? Does it mean I can change color? I can do all this? Does it mean I can't? Does it mean anything? I can add 1,000 more lights, or I can add 3 more lights. I think asking what the limit of that system is, even if you're not going to hit it on day one, is worth knowing, and is a good concept in terms of get in the habit of asking.
Yeah, I like that, and it's a conversation that you have to have with clients, and you have to kind of take all these things into account: budget, and again, the fixtures on the front end side, things that people see, and then you have to do all the back end infrastructure, which is the things you don't see, but those things are all important. You have to balance those. Let's see if you have any more questions here. Let's see. What are your we talked about a little bit in the pre-tape stuff, but the kind of the future of the industry. But as far as products, do you think that like the ellipsoidal, the Fresnel, the moving light, do you think they're going to evolve past where they are now? Or do you think it's just what do you?
I think they are what they are, right? I mean, ultimately, they're just devices that put out light. Like, we can complicate it as much as we want. Like, it's just a light. There's newer technology. There's newer. Honestly, I think we're the biggest developmental curve. And again, it's sort of unsexy. Is where I imagine a lot of it's going to go, and you see certain manufacturers really leaning into it, is the color science, right? We had talked about the spikiness of LEDs and all of that. How do you PC them? How do you do all that? I think you're going to see manufacturers have accomplished brightness, right? You talk about some of the movers, you can see them for miles. You talk about some of the Legos, they're as heck. And I think there's always going to be that arms race to be the brightest, and I think that'll play out in Legos, movers, everything. But I think where manufacturers are really going to make their bones, and you see it with Flow, you see some of the like old school color science aperture really digging into it, is that color science and color rendition. I really think that's where across the board fixture wise, you're going to see the most evolution in the next 5-10 years is better color rendition, not just visually, but on camera. There are really interesting rabbit holes to go down with if you Google, color science lighting, and all that. You'll see what the differences are and how those, spiky waveforms impact color rendition on camera. And I really think that's going to be the biggest development. Or focus.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, Mike. Well, I think we're kind of out of questions here, so I'm gonna kind of put a pin in it. This wraps up this episode of Broadcast to Post. Michael, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Of course, it was good. And good seeing you. I haven't seen, we used to run around on job sites like lunatics together, 10, 15 years ago. So.
All right. Still running around, just not quite as like a lunatic anymore, right?
That's fair.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you want more educational information, you want to talk more strategy, contact us here at Keycode Media. We could be more Broadcast to Post to follow. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to Keycode Media. Mike, do you have any plugs you want
to? No, just find us at ldg.com or ldg.entertainment on Instagram. We're all over. So look up Lighting Design Group. Say hello.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for watching Broadcast to Post. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast to receive future episodes. Follow Keycode Media on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram to receive news on additional AV, broadcast, and post-production technology content. See you next time, folks.